Okay, so we've got the artist Stephen Newton, and I'm going to do a Q&A first of all, and then we'll do the demo later on about techniques for using impasto and working in a palette knife and that sort of thing. So I'm going to start with some questions and thoughts from the students before I get into my own questions. So one of the students asks, how long does it take to finish a painting? And also, do you work on more than one at the same time?
Yes, I have often worked on sometimes 20, 25 paintings will be in process at one time, all at different stages of development. And so I will have a lot of canvases where I'm applying paint over a long period, sometimes a year, 2 years. And when the surface is what I'm looking for, then I will paint the picture.
Ah, okay. So you work up the surface till it's the right texture.
I do.
And then, that's so interesting. And that answers one of my other questions that I was going to talk about later, but we'll talk more about that later, the texture thing.
Sure.
That's so very interesting, because I was wondering about whether you have the images appearing, but you keep obliterating them, but it's not that. It's more about getting the texture right.
Yes, it is.
Abstractly, first of all, and then you.
Yes, I thought your appraisal of my work, Joe, was very impressive indeed. I was quite touched by that. And I think one thing you touched on, the fact that all my work is fundamentally abstract. So obviously when I'm working on the surfaces, the paintings remain abstract right through to the completion.
Right. So you're not really thinking about realism, but they come out as representational or something. But it's,
well, I think that as you touched on a moment ago, I have been designated by some people as an icon painter, and I think there's an awful lot of truth in that, although I didn't recognize that until it was pointed out to me. But the fact is that the iconography that I've evolved over many years is used in a way in which it is evolved from the impasto. I mean, in my perspective, the emotional depth of the artwork and the creative process is embedded in the impasto and in the materiality of the painting, and the motifs, if you like, or the icons are evolved from that emotional engagement. So in other words, I don't really superimpose realistic elements onto a painting surface. It's rather the other way around. I believe that the emotional element evolves the iconography in the same sense, and I think I do mention this in my catalogue introduction. I always say that my painting has a similar structural element to the dream, which of course is a very natural, organic aspect to our everyday life. And in the dream, of course, the emotion of that is set free during sleep has to be in some way contained, and the dream fulfills this, of course, by developing a narrative and a set of imagery to couch the emotion that is given off during sleep, you see. And although I must stress that my paintings don't have anything to do with narrative or imagery in the sense of symbolism or what something might mean. It does work in tandem in the aspect that the iconographic elements are evolved from the materiality of the painting process.
So is it that once you reach a certain materiality, as you say, that then the images suggest themselves to you through the textures that are appearing on the canvas?
I think so, yeah. It's obviously I do have a process where I have numerous notebooks, and I'm continually drawing spontaneous inchoate sketches all the time, and I fill notebooks with these little primitive manic drawings, and then when I look through these notebooks, many of which go back many years, an image will jump out at me which I can see on a particular size, on a particular surface. And then the two will be married, but not obviously exactly the same, because as I say, the process of the evolution of the image is very important to me. I don't ever superimpose a realistic scene upon a canvas.
Yeah, so you're working in collaboration with your notebooks and your ideas.
Absolutely.
And something fits right with what you've produced abstractively, if that makes
absolutely
a word, and they come together within. Yeah, that's really interesting.
Absolutely. I mean, just while I remember, I thought it was very apposite that you mentioned Morandi in the context of my work, because of course Morandi is a painter that I've got a very special love for. So and again, all of his paintings are abstract.
Yeah, and the way the kind of repetition of motif, even though he's using, it's not so much a motif as an actual object, but the repetition that happens and
it's a very similar thing. It's a very similar thing to what I'm doing myself, because there is a repetition of motif continually all the way through. But of course, it's the tension that I try to generate between the objects in the images. I mean, the objects, the relationships between them, I'm looking to generate a tension, which obviously is an emotional tension to affect the viewer.
Yeah, thank you, that's great. So and then this same student said about how the paintings evoke a feeling of sadness within them, and they were wondering if you have a sadness within you too about life, like whether that is coming through.
Well, I mean, I'm an absolute believer that your whole personality is immersed in the materiality of the painting. I mean, I do believe that. So nothing that I do is, as it were, preconceived, or I don't ever try to express something that I feel that I might have experienced or anything like that. It's just that in the process of painting, it's inevitable that myself and my personality find their way into the painting. I mean, it's just unavoidable. I don't see myself as sad. I've got a really happy life, but of course, I think in everybody's deep psyche there are regrets, there are moments of intense sadness, which can wake you with an awful jolt in the night, and you can wake with a cold sweat because you think, oh God, why did I do that? I should have done something else, and I've let somebody down, and which we all let people down, and you regret that, you hurt people, and all sorts of things. And I think all those emotions, I think if you can evolve a method of allowing unconsciousness to find its way into your painting, then I think all of these issues inevitably find the way into the iconography that you use. I mean, my iconography appears to be sort of harmless, pointless, empty, as you say, but in a strange way, I recognize that it often has the opposite effect to what it might seem to have. It seems innocuous, it seems innocent, and yet a lot of people will say they find it very disturbing. So I think emptiness can be far more disturbing than all the hobgoblins and fiery dragons of Hieronymus Bosch and people like that. So
it's almost, sorry to interrupt, but it's almost like a frightening thing, isn't it? There's all the emptiness. It means if you don't have, because packing things in can be a way of avoiding kind of your emotions. So if there's an emptiness, it's like you're then potentially forced to kind of consider something you might be running away from, or
good point.
So thank you. Okay. So the student also said they're quite powerful, and they would like to see them in real life, which I've said that it's something that really you need to see really in real life, especially because of the olfactory thing and the whole, the visceralness. And they went on to say there's an emptiness about them, which they've not seen in other interiors, and the texture of the paint seems to make up for this, rendering, and we just talked about emptiness, so this fits really well, but the texture of the paint seems to make up for that, rendering further detail superfluous. And they also go on to say that your drawings also have a texture about them similar to the painting, which was something I was going to talk about and I forgot. But where it's so interesting in the drawings, and I haven't got any examples to show, but the texture, there's a real feeling of texture in those as well. We'll get back to that later. So if I can move on to the interpretation of the inside outside, that this student was also interested in, and the windows which hint at different worlds and escape, which I talked about in the presentations, and we'll come back to that in the other questions later. And so another student had a question which was, what's your relationship with the viewer? Which is a big question, but there you
are. My relationship with the viewer. Well, my ultimate objective is to emotionally touch the viewer. That obviously is the whole ambition of what I do, is to engage and to immerse the viewer in what I'm doing, but also you mentioned a couple of times about the edges of the paint, the edges of the canvases, which might show earlier layers. And the way I work, especially work that I did a few years ago, where I used to actually leave the edges of the canvas very sketchy and empty, in the same way as, say, a painter like Philip Guston would do in his pure abstract paintings. If you look at the edges, often they're very often just pure canvas, and then they evolve into a sort of a putative depth in the center. And I was a great believer in respect of my relationship with the viewer, to carry the viewer vicariously through my creative process. Because I think if I can engage the viewer in the whole of my creative process quickly, if they can glean unconsciously or instinctively an idea of how I've moved through the creative process very, very quickly, then they can potentially attain that release of tension, even an ecstatic release, which is the high that an artwork can give to the viewer. The viewer can get an instant high, obviously from art, whether it's music or sculpture or anything, but you can get that instant high, which is like a release of tension. And I aim to engage the viewer. I'm not saying you can do that always or every time. It's possibly quite a rare thing, and I think the viewer has to have a receptivity and obviously perhaps an understanding or potential to engage with the language in order to experience that. But so that is what I want the viewer to experience, to go through my creative process and to feel what I feel.
Yeah, that's really interesting as well. What always fascinates me not only is how, you know, lots of different students drawing the same thing, they'll all come out completely different. That's one of the things that never endingly fascinates me, but also how, you know, one person standing in front of a Rothko will be reduced to tears. Somebody else might just not even notice it or hardly think about it, or just feel like it's just a blobs, you know, just blobs on canvas or something. And that, so yeah, it's really interesting the way what you said about how, you know, you have a idea of how you'd like for people to engage with the work, but it's not necessarily going to happen. It potentially could be quite rare. But also in terms of how people are moved, like if people are moved to joy or people are moved to sadness, that's something that I always feel as an artist, if I've achieved one or the other, you know, it doesn't really matter what the emotional thing that you've evoked in someone is. If they're emotionally moved, then it's a successful engagement for the viewer. Would that be something you agree with? Like,
absolutely. I mean, I was only reading yesterday a piece about Greek tragedy where it was saying that, you know, the authors of Greek tragedies said that if you can carry the audience vicariously through tragedy in that setting, in order for them to face it in a dramatic theatrical setting, then it gives them an element of strength to face possible tragedy in reality, and I do believe that. And
that's a really good. Yeah. Sorry, I've cut you off.
No, it's okay, Joe.
Yeah,
it's okay.
Yeah, no, that's great. Okay. So, and this other question from the same different student is, what is the optimum response that you have had and would like to have from viewers of your work?
Well, in the last show that you so beautifully described, one well, I've had this a few times actually, to be quite honest. One woman, an Irish poet, she was in tears.
Wow.
And she said to me after that some of the paintings made her cry, and I have had that before, that people have cried. So which is a surprise to me, of course, which to get such a response is a terrific thing, absolutely terrific thing, which, you know, really, I don't know, not at all sure that I deserve it, but I think to some people, I'm always hoping to connect and touch some universal unconscious element, which, is, you pointed out, is common to us all, which consciousness, we tend to ignore it or try to repress it, to use a psychoanalytic term. But if you can touch those really deep emotional states, I think that it can bring somebody to tears.
Yeah, I think, and it's so subjective as well.
Yeah.
You know, that get the right balance that touches on somebody's particular personal emotional response to whatever thing, you know, and it must vary as well. But yeah, I think, you completely deserve it. Your work is amazing, so don't question that. So I'll get on to the list of questions that I made. So your PhD in psychoanalysis of the creative process. So if you could
Yeah.
tell us a little bit about that and how it relates to your work and also to artists' work in general. It's something that's really interesting. So I know you've touched on it a little bit already, but
well, I would say in relation to that what happened was I was trying to reach a position in painting many years ago when I was in my 20s, which I instinctively craved. It was an unconscious position that I couldn't get to, and it led me slowly but surely to a series of pure monochromatic abstract canvas collages, you see, in which, strangely enough, oddly enough, my objective was to strip them of anything that painting was supposed to be about. So I eliminated line, composition, texture, color, everything that I, had come to believe painting was about, I eliminated from the work. So, and this enabled me to access this unconscious space, which is sometimes called a pictorial space in theoretical writing. And what happened was I had some unusual psychological experiences in these monochromatic paintings, which made me question what on earth was going on and how could these experiences be procured just in a square canvas. And this led me on to psychoanalytic investigation as to what I was actually doing. So, I mean, everything I did was naive, instinctive, without any sort of prior knowledge. But then when I began to research psychoanalysis, I began to read theoretical positions which described in detail exactly what I had done as an abstract painter. And that really, really shook me to the core, because I couldn't understand how psychoanalytic theorists could understand step by step, describe step by step what I had done as an abstract painter. And so obviously I recognized that there was something there that I needed to understand.
So like process, that they were able to put your process into words.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah. I could read you a little bit.
Yeah, go on. Just I think
I don't want to.
Might run over, but that's okay.
Yeah, well, I won't bother reading anything. But for instance, I read a lot of psychoanalytic theorists. Ernst Chris, Hannah Segal, Melanie Klein, and so on. I think one theorist that had a big influence on me was a chap called Anton Ehrenzweig. He wrote a famous book in the 60s called The Hidden Order of Art. I think this is why I've called my latest book The Hidden Essence of Art, because in a way it pays homage to him. Incidentally, the book's not out yet, but it is coming out shortly with Morel Books. But he described exactly what I was doing in these monochromatic canvas collages, where I would just throw fragments onto a glued surface and then integrate them with a color virtually the same as the fragments that I'd spontaneously thrown onto the surface. And he describes this process, which he calls the 3 phases of creativity, which he describes as the minimum content of art.
And what are those 3? What are the 3 phases?
Well, basically, he says that the initial stage of the creative process is a schizoid stage, where the artist expels or exercises fragmented parts of the self into the canvas. These are then these are unwanted and persecutory elements, which they often are. You talk about some students who find it very difficult to paint on a virgin canvas, have a lot of difficulty making marks, because these rudimentary, primitive early marks, in psychological terms, are associated with persecution and guilt and conscience, because they fly in the face of they fly directly in the face of conscience, because they do not fit in with what consciousness wants us to adhere to, which is something that is ordered, something that is well balanced, something that is well constructed. And the initial fragmented projection is going to be the opposite of those things. So the first stage in any artwork is almost always this stage, and the artist, of course, is keen to order this chaos. And in the second stage of the creative process, these elements are integrated into a monochrome sheet. And then the third stage, this finished artwork, is what Ehrenzweig says is reintegrated into the mind on a higher level. And that basically is his creative process.
Wow. Okay. That's so interesting. I'm taking notes.
But I actually did that in monochromatic collages before I'd read anything. And it was from those monochromatic paintings that the iconography evolved.
Great. Great. So it's like you have those stages happening within your process.
It happens like even now, within everything I do. But of course, some of those works did generate what I would call, well, to be honest, more or less out of body experiences, because as the mind is materialized in the painting process, you feel as if you're almost in a trance experience. Of course, I mean, sometime later, I recognized, which I've written extensively about, that the ritual process, a universal process, tribal ritual, you might call it, involves exactly the same three stages. And of course, the other thing is, which I maybe just mentioned, is if one reads a psychoanalytic thinker like Melanie Klein, for instance, she describes exactly the same three processes in infant development in the first few months of life.
Oh, wow. So everything is connected.
Yeah, it's all connected. And basically in the monochromes, I did go back to the early months of life, in order to resurrect something that needed to be altered.
Wow. So it's almost like you're using the creative process as a form of therapy in some way.
No question. I think that there is always a therapeutic element to it. I'm not saying it's exclusively ever healing or therapy, but there is a therapeutic nucleus to the creative process. I think at its core, it does have that therapeutic element.
That's so interesting, and something that I think is very much undervalued within our society.
I agree.
Contemporary society, and people just do not realize the value. And I see it so many times in my work with people, the healing nature.
Incidentally, Joe, I'll just mention, just while we're on that topic, you mentioned abstract expressionism earlier on. In fact, I would argue that what somebody like Jackson Pollock or Philip Guston were doing, they were actually isolating this minimum content of art and contacting this oceanic limit that is at the core of the creative process. I think that the state of culture at the time more or less demanded that sort of inner analysis.
So almost like becoming in touch with the collective unconscious as well.
Sort of.
Yeah, yeah. Okay, interesting. I've had a question pop up from a student who says, can I ask you why the object, such as a sofa and a table, are like in the middle of some of the paintings? So like, is it like they're the stage and a center for the viewer?
I think that a lot of my paintings, you mentioned stage then, I immediately thought that they are almost stage sets.
Yeah, very theatrical almost.
Yeah, theatrical. And I think if you look at a lot of icon paintings, obviously, you know, from the past centuries, religious icon paintings, they are almost all in stage sets. You know, the odd staircases and odd architecture, and strange elements in them, they're all stage sets. So I think that a lot of my work could be almost a stage set. And so I think that if a sofa takes center stage, I think it's almost like a theatrical stage set before the actors come on, you know.
Yeah, like the setting for.
Yeah,
and that I think is part of the psychological element that the viewer then brings an idea of what might happen within, a bit like Patrick Caulfield, where there's that sense as well.
Yes.
Of like what's happened, what's about to happen.
Yeah.
Yeah, very interesting. Thank you. And within that, I mean, there are artists who have done stage sets. I mean, I think Tom Phillips is an example. I think he did opera or something. I can't remember the details now, but I mean, is that something you've ever thought of yourself? Would it be something you'd be interested in developing?
Strangely enough, a principal at the Royal Ballet in Covent Garden approached me about doing some stage sets.
Brilliant. There you are then. Go for it.
Yeah, this was, well, it was a long time ago, and I didn't pursue it because I didn't think that I could do it.
Oh, okay.
I really didn't. I mean, strangely enough, my daughter was a ballet dancer for many years, so I had that connection. I saw her perform all over the country, you know, so I suppose I saw an awful lot of stage sets.
So you kind of, maybe the leap. I could see it. I could see it working. Maybe you should get back in touch. Have a go. Why not?
Yeah.
Anyway, I have got one eye on the time. I think we are going to overrun, but that's fine as long as that's fine with the students.
Yeah, I'm quite happy, Joe. Yeah.
So, okay. So then I think we've covered this one. So your starting point with the painting. Painted canvases and how they evolve on their own. So we've already covered that, so that's good. And so the texture and your use of layering. So we've also covered that. So it isn't that there are images underneath. You're actually playing with paint and creating the right texture, which you then so the images come at the end.
Absolutely. It's a strange. I mean, obviously in the process of painting, things are obliterated and painted out, and things are altered and changed, and in that process various things happen with the materiality, which is not preconceived and can never be deliberate or consciously articulated, and in that sense, I think you have to let the painting speak for itself always, because you're having a dialogue with the painting, and as in a dialogue with anybody else, you have to let them speak. You must let them have their own voice, and you must let them have their own life. And I think a lot of artists tend to want to control the canvas. They're not prepared to allow the painting to have its own voice, and sometimes that voice can appear to the painter to be very toxic and unacceptable. But I think that it's then that you have to accept it. And I think a painter must evolve a depth of tolerance and acceptance as the mature person should in relationships with other people anyway.
Yeah, that's a really interesting, very good point as well. And it's, I mean, I say to my students all the time, even when you're drawing from observation or you're using an image as inspiration, there comes a point at which the actual work that you're working on takes over, and you're referring less and less to your original source material. I think it becomes about the painting and how, like you say, which direction it wants to go in and how it wants to evolve.
Yeah, I think this is very, very important, because obviously if you're just painting from life, then you're an illustrator, really. And I think that the way Impressionism moved to Expressionism culturally, historically, was very important. And I think the painter has to move from an impressionistic position to an expressionistic one, where, I mean, I use reality, or I use elements of reality, or I use my representatives of elements of reality to express things about reality. But I find it much more powerful than trying to paint realism as it actually is naturally, which doesn't give me the emotional power that I'm looking for.
Oh, absolutely. And there are all these other elements that are happening within the work. Like I said before, it kind of is as important as the kind of what the images are within the work. You know, you get this amazing dialogue happening within the picture. So I think that's really interesting. So yeah, the olfactory element. So is it something that's important? And how do you feel it might influence the viewer's experience of the work? So for those of you who haven't seen the work in real life, they just smell absolutely gorgeous of kind of linseed oil and oil paint, and you get this amazing, so it's not just the visual experience, you've also got this olfactory experience happening. Is it just an accident? Is it like not important, or do you feel
it's not something that concerns me, or it's inevitable, but so many people comment and react to it that I can't really complain. But I think the whole point about oil paint and why I use it is because over a period, when you're painting a picture, it can be changed, it can be altered, and also oil paint prevents you really from doing many things that you would like to do. So there's always this element of lack of control. Whereas I have painted with acrylics, and obviously they dry quickly, and you can get the effect exactly that you require. But I prefer oil paint, where you have to struggle to evolve what you want, and it won't do what you want. Also, I think the painter who uses oil paint has to be aware, which I'm very much aware of what happens to it when it dries out. And this can take many years, incidentally, many years. I mean, some people say that oil paint never completely dries, but so for many years after, it is giving off this olfactory element, and it is slowly drying. But I think it's important, if you're using oil paint, to know what it's going to do. I mean, I saw a show of Auerbach's recently at the Tate Britain, and I could see that an awful lot of his paint had shriveled badly.
Yeah, you get wrinkling.
Wrinkled and shriveled, and he tried to some of his works he put behind perspex to obviously try to halt this process. But I think that to be fair, he should have been aware of this, which I certainly am. What I tend to do is the underneath layers, I will be turning them over with a palette knife continually to eliminate the linseed oil, and to give it the opportunity to evaporate and so on. And so this is why I have so many canvases on the go, because I'm continually manipulating the paint until it gets to the position that I need it to be.
Right. Yeah. And then and kind of altering how it would naturally if it dried, it might wrinkle, but you're preventing that with your manipulation. So
You can't always do it. I mean, it's not always successful, and sometimes linseed oil can break through to the surface of a painting and discolor elements of it. But I think over time, you learn more and more and more about what is going to happen and what effects particular colors have if put on top of other colors and so on. You know, these are just practical things which are difficult to learn, and it takes an awful long time.
Yeah. So I've started using essential oils in the mix with my linseed oil. I'll put a bit of lavender oil or rose oil, so you get the smells coming up. And I wondered if that's anything you've kind of thought about experimenting with, or whether it might, in terms of play. No. Okay. Simple answer. That's fine. And so, yeah, in terms of the way you're drawing into the canvas, are you using the back of a paintbrush, or is it a palette knife, or?
I always feel that the way I paint is quite uncontrolled and wild, and it's quite spontaneous. I very rarely achieve anything that I deliberately want to achieve in a canvas. So I haven't really got a set process. I do use brushes to paint line, and I will paint over that line to suppress it, to reduce its strength and so on. So there's always this engagement where things are being continually altered and changed, and often this is the paradox of painting, the contradiction all the time. Sometimes it will be so frustrating, the struggle, and you end up with something that you feel is really, really awful. You have to push it to a point where you think this will never ever work, and then you can be very, very tired, because sometimes it's always the same when you're approaching the end of something. You're not where you want to be, and you keep going even though you're too tired, really, and you maybe had nothing to eat, but you have to keep going. And then something can happen which completely fulfills your objectives.
Yeah, you have like a breakthrough. It's like we looked at a photographer. It was either Sarah Moon or Deborah Turbeville. I think it was Sarah Moon. There's a great YouTube video of her talking about her creative process, and she expresses it in such a lovely way. And it's about that she's like chasing something, and then she can't find it, and then she'll feel like giving up completely, and why am I even bothering being an artist? And then suddenly she'll catch the thread and it'll start working, and it's it's that
I think I think the creative process, like I had, just harking back to those monochromatic abstractions that I painted, it was all about destroying conscious control and getting myself in a position where I could eliminate conscious control from my creative process. For me, that was very important.
Yeah, and that's the ultimate thing, where you're just completely lost in the creative process, and you're just going with, it's flowing through you. Yeah,
definitely.
Lovely. Okay, so we've covered gesture mark making. We haven't so much talked about outline, so we've covered abstraction, but maybe the outline, is that something that just comes, or
I mean, some of the works, the outlines, well, I mentioned the word suppressed. It varies, Joe. Sometimes they're quite bold, sometimes they're painted out, which I like to do very, very much. I'll have an outline, but then I paint them out, the outlines out, but they're still there. But so there's no set process with me in respect of anything like that. It's just I wing it until something happens that I think is worthwhile.
Okay, great. And so I think we've covered pretty much everything else in the questions. The only other thing was the titles. Like how do they come
I
to you?
I think they, some people have pointed out the importance of my titles, and I do think, I think somebody once said they're like an icon on a computer screen, and I think they are. They're very, very much reduced to the point, very lacking in description. They just say it as it is, and there's absolutely nothing else. They're minimal without a doubt, and the titles are incredibly important to me, incredibly important, and any work has to be seen in the context of its title.
So the descriptive nature of them is part of it, I think.
Yeah,
they're quite, in a sense, maybe ordinary, like it's an ordinary scene, and yet within the work there's so much more going on that it kind of,
spot on. There's that contradiction, and I do like that paradox, that it seems innocuous, it seems innocent, and yet it's describing something that isn't.
There's so much more things, layering and deeper layers within it. Just before we end, there's a question from Usha. Says,
I want to ask something too.
I'm going to open it up. I'm going to open it up, but just Usha's put in the chat, how do you get the surface, like the bubbles and standing out, the surface of the paint?
Well, I do this by obviously applying heavy impasto over a period, but then I do paint into that impasto. And I think it's important to in terms of process, that I buy tins of oil paint, 2.5 litre usually.
Wow.
And I will open the lids of this paint on arrival so that it's already drying. Then I will mix up quite huge amounts of colour. So in other words, whereas you've got you might have a small palette with various colours on, I might have a huge table with huge blobs of paint on like that. It's a massive palette. But what is happening is that the paint is drying and becoming quite thick and losing viscosity from the moment I put it out. And then when I'm painting a picture, I can select, it's not so much the color I'm looking for, it's the consistency that I'm looking for. So it's which amount of paint is at the right stage of drying for me to be able to use it on that particular painting.
And to create the kind of textural effects that
to create which I think the image requires.
And do you use much linseed oil, when you're mixing it?
I don't use any.
Okay.
No, I mean, I spend my time trying to eliminate the linseed oil that's already in the paint.
Oh, okay.
The first thing I do with any tin is pour all the linseed oil away and start to stir the paint up to make it more densely viscous. And I think it's very, very important. I think, when I was younger, I tried to use paint that was thin or, as you say, had linseed oil in it, or might mix it with terps. And it's impossible to get the effects that I personally wanted.
Yeah, your textures.
Yeah.
Interesting. Thank you. That's brilliant. Okay, so I'll just briefly open it up. I think we should definitely take a break in 5 minutes, and that means we'll just have an hour for the practical. I hope that's okay with everybody. So anybody, I'm going to unmute you all.
Yeah. Yes, can I talk?
Yes, Alice. What would you like to say?
I don't think we talked about it, but resistance and just how Stephen Pressfield talks about resistance, and it's really hard to just get things done or to even start. Or how is your day? Like, how do you organize your days to get all this stuff done? And
I think that's I think that's interesting about resistance. Yeah. it's it's a very good question, because instinctively we don't want to do anything.
No.
So I think you have to find psychological tricks to trip yourself into doing things that I find once I'm engaged, Alice, I'm okay. But as you say, it's initiating that engagement, and it's very difficult when you're faced with a blank canvas. And this is why I like to have so many in process, because then I'm not faced with that daunting proposition of starting from scratch with something. So what I tend to do is rather than, I never ever go in the studio saying I'm going to finish a painting.
Oh.
I think that would be something I couldn't ever do. So what I do is I'll go in the studio and say, I'm just going to mix up some paint, or I'll just put a couple of coats on this canvas. Or sometimes this extends into other things, but I never ever go in with some conscious preconception that I'm going to paint this image and finish it in that day or anything like that. So I think that's held me in good stead, that I work within what I think is possibility, and work within what I think I'm capable of and what I can mentally handle.
Great, thank you.
Thank you.
Anybody else? Anybody got? I know some of you already had. We answered some. Anybody else got any questions? No, is that everyone needs a cup of tea?
I might
Oh,
be
Sonia.
great. Sorry.
That's fine.
Sorry. Hold on. I'm reading my notes. Okay, I'm Spanish, so forget the thing.
Okay.
Is the separation of items in the paintings, is that to show the insulation and the layers are kind of that you're living with the process your whole life, about any negative insulations, you know, like you describe in your work?
I think so.
It's like you have to live with it and learn to enjoy it. Some kind of is what I get it.
Well, I mean, I don't think I ever enjoy it. I mean, you sometimes see people on TV saying, "Oh, I love to paint. It's the most relaxing thing I ever do. I can get an easel out and I can feel, you know, it's real." Well, that's great if it's a hobby, and there's nothing wrong with that. And if you want to use it as a pastime, that's absolutely fine. But I think certainly in my case, a lot of the struggle in painting has been very painful and very difficult, and not something that I particularly enjoyed at all. I can enjoy the end product, but usually quite a long time after the event. I think in respect of isolation, I think you mentioned, I think that, what I'm trying to come to terms with in painting is not necessarily my personal isolation. It's the isolation that every human being is inevitably faced with. We're all absolutely alone. I mean, and although we have superficial contact with other people, it's really very superficial, and you're ultimately alone. I mean,
Yeah, we're all gonna die.
Absolutely. I mean,
we're all going to die alone. Oh my goodness.
I had a show. I had a painting in a show recently in the American Museum in Washington, which was on death. The actual show was on death, and I painted a painting called, well, I had a painting called The Wake, which just had a coffin in front of a window, and I think the point is about. Somebody said at the core of all my painting is death, which I do think there's certainly an element of truth in that.
Yeah, there is like a kind of ghostliness, I think, somehow within a lot of them. A lot of them have this kind of feeling of unease, almost like a ghostly element to them, which obviously, and ghosts is very much linked with death. So.
Incidentally, I would say that I would just make the point that none of these aspects were ever intended consciously by me to put them in the painting. The fact that they're there was purely a byproduct of what I was doing. I never ever set out to do a sad painting or an empty painting or a painting that deals with isolation. It was just a byproduct of the way the work evolved.
Yeah, and I suppose that's, yeah, at the end of the day, you never know what other people are going to see within your, as an artist. It's like lots of different people will interpret it in lots of different ways, and
True, and that's a good
can't
thing.
really control that.
That's a good thing because it's touching on their personal experience, and if they can engage with the work, and if it makes relevance and sense to them in their own personal life, then that is fantastic.
Yeah, you can't. Yeah, it's something you haven't got ultimately any control over.
No.
Yeah. Okay. Well, thank you ever so much. Thank you for coming and speaking with us. And we will take a break now. I'm going to end.
Thank you.
This part of the recording.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Thank you.